Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Personally, it is the greatest pleasure because I had never met somebody with PhD and a farmer of 4,000-acre farm. Coming from Asia, South Asia, 4 acre is already a big farm. It is 1,000 times that. So that's, I want to read the line by line because it's very interesting for you. When I read this morning, I thought everybody should know. So Bob Quinn, BS in Botany, MS Plant Pathology, PhD Plant Biochemistry, runs a wheat and cattle ranch southeast of Big Sandy, Montana. He started Montana Flour and Grains Incorporation to market his own grain directly to whole grain bakeries. In 1986, the MFG introduced an ancient grain similar to durum wheat, grown only organically and marketed under his own brand name Kamut. Now over 4,500 different Kamut brand products are being marketed, providing a new crop for over 250 organic farmers in Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, Canada. In 1986, Bob planted his first organic certified crop on his own farm and was farming the entire farm organically in 1989. His farm is now 4,000 acres of crops and pastures. He has written the book Grain by Grain, a quest to revive ancient wheat, rural jobs, and healthy food, with his co-editor Liz Carlyle, which summarizes his philosophy of the tie between agriculture, food, and health, human health. In 2023, he donated 700 acres from the middle of his farm to create a regenerative organic research, education, and health institute, the Quinn Institute, whose mission and focus is healing the earth by growing food as medicine. It's my greatest pleasure. On behalf of my colleagues, I really welcome you, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Bob Quinn.
Thank you very much. It's very kind, and it's really a great honor to be here. Started out your first session of the whole season, I understand. They told me I only had 30 minutes to present. They will have some questions, so I decided to write a book. You already heard about it, but I'm glad I took the time to do that here in the last few weeks, so I don't have to tell the whole story in 30 minutes, so that you can read whatever you want in the extras. So I am, as you heard, this is our farm out of Big Sandy. It's between the Bear Paw Mountains and the Missouri River breaks in north central Montana. So today's presentation, skipped one already. Today's presentation. So we have in this country the most productive agriculture in the world, but most of our farms are going broke. It's no different in Montana. I'm sure you have the same financial challenges here in Ohio. We have the most abundant, cheapest food in the world, but most of our people are chronically ill, 75%, mostly due to food. Big Ag and Big Pharma got us into this mess over the last a few decades, and I believe that regenerative organic agriculture can get us out. And from my experiences, I have come to this conclusion, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So how I got this idea and my experiences of arriving to this conclusion. So in my early years, I wasn't born organic. I was raised very, very chemically oriented. In all my schooling and my high school, my college, it was all in chemical ag. But I had two loves growing up. One was plants and one was science. And so when I went to college, that's what I studied. I put those two together and went on. 10 years it took me to go through all those degrees in college. And after that and 2 years of running a business that I started in California, Montana really looked good to me. So we decided to pack up and move home, my family and I. And I want you to understand something very important at this point. When I came home, I didn't intend to change anything. I thought everything was really pretty fine the way it was, and everything was going well, and I didn't see there was any need for anything different. When I got home, the first thing we found out that our farm of about 2,400 acres at that time, and that was just about average size for Montana. Montana, the average size farm is about 2,500 acres now, and or in those days, and it's just right size for one family. But now my folks are still there, so now we have two families on one farm, and that presented the problem. So I decided to add value to our crops that we're growing. The main crop was wheat. We raised wheat and barley, and we had cows. I started Montana Flour and Grain in 1983 to directly sell our wheat to whole grain bakers in California. They were willing to pay us $1 a bushel premium. In those days, we were getting $3 is all we were getting. That was a third more. That was huge. That was a huge benefit to us. So we increased the value of our grain by 1/3 in just this business. And then everything was going just as smooth as silk the first year. And then I got a call from our biggest customer in the summer of 1984. And he kind of went like this. He said, his name was Jim. He called up and said, "Hey, Bob," he says, "I love the wheat you're sending us." He said, "Do you suppose you can find some organic grain just about the same kind of quality?" And I said, "Oh, Jim, sure, yeah, don't worry about a thing. We'll have it down in a few weeks." And I hung up the phone and I thought, oh my gosh, what did I just say? Because I didn't even know any organic farmers. In fact, I didn't even believe in this organic stuff because I had been taught all my days in school that a plant could not tell the difference between a molecule of nitrogen, for example, coming from a manure pile or one coming from a bag of ammonium sulfate. And that's what I believed. But I didn't want my prejudice to stand in the way of giving my customer, our biggest customer, what they wanted. So I started making phone calls. And in 1984, there weren't very many organic farmers in Montana. But I found a couple up in the northeast corner, about 300 miles away from me. I took my truck up, filled it up, brought it back, cleaned it, sent it to California. And they loved it. And they said, "Well, take another load." Then another load. And man, I was really pushed. But I made by the end of that summer, I made a whole new group of friends. And they invited me to some of their meetings in the wintertime to kind of get together and talk about shop. And I've been used to going to Farm Bureau meetings and grain grower meetings all my life. And the tone of those meetings, is generally, woe is me, the government program's not giving us what we need, and the price is in the toilet, and what are we going to do, and on and on. When I went to this organic meeting, there was none of that kind of talk. They talked about how they could walk over their fields and feel the tilth increasing, the softness in the soil under their feet. The soil was changing. They talked about raising their own fertilizer. They talked about using rotations to break up disease and insect cycles so they didn't need to use pesticides or herbicides. Then the scientist in me kind of started to come up again, and I thought, wow, we need to try this. And I went home and I said, "Dad, we need to try this." And we got 20 acres of alfalfa. It had been alfalfa for 3 years, just on the end of a field. It was kind of a problem field. We worked that down, and we planted winter wheat that fall. And then we compared that to a winter wheat crop right next to it. And after harvest time, so here's the alfalfa field that we had in alfalfa for 3 years, and we planted it in the fall of '86. I took some soil samples. I wanted to make sure the nitrogen, that's pretty important to us, was the same in both fields. So we measured what it was in the alfalfa plow now. It was 96 pounds an acre. So we added a urea to the 40 pounds we found in the summer fallow field. That's what we're normally doing in those days. And so they'd be equal. And then we planted winter wheat and harvested winter wheat in '87. And the bushels, the yields, you see, were almost the same. That year we had 33 bushels in organic and 34 in the conventional one. The proteins were also nothing any different, about the same, 15.3 in the organic, 16 in the conventional. And I was thrilled. My experimental work, my father was astounded. I mean, here he had been spending tens of thousands of dollars on inputs, fertilizers and sprays and everything. And this young whippersnapper son of his and had come back from California and equaled what he had been doing with all these inputs. I said, wow, look at this, Dad. We should do half the farm in organic next year. And he said, whoa, whoa, whoa. He says, we don't even know what we're doing, which was true, of course. And he said, how about 10%? I said, how about 25? He says, 15. So the next year we went to 15% of the farm now was an organic experiment because it wasn't a plow down rate thing, it was just a stopping to use the chemicals. And that year was a drought year. That was a bad year. We planted durum. We normally don't plant crops one after another, but that year I did. And look at the yield. We had 4 bushel on the organic, which is barely enough to pay a few expenses, and there was 0 on the field next to it. But on the regular summer fallow fields where we had a crop coming, in Montana when we have drought, we normally have grasshoppers, and the grasshoppers were coming that year. And of course, I knew what to do as a chemical farmer. You just call up the spray boys in town and say, oh, I got grasshoppers, they'll be out in the mornings. Boom, here they come with their spray plane, malathion all over everything. In just a couple hours, everything is dead. And they said, now, be sure don't go in that field because, you know, malathion is a poison, you know. And I said, oh, I know. But then I called up my organic friends and I said, whoa, what do you do for grasshoppers? And they said, well, just calm down, calm down. There's a product called Nosema locusta. It's a protozoa, a little smaller bacteria, and you put it on wheat bran, you scatter it around the edge of the field. The grasshoppers are coming in now from the pastures that are drying up into the crops fields. They eat the wheat bran, and then they get sick, and they start to die. And then their friends all come and eat them. It's just like politics in America today. And they spread the disease then clear through all of the grasshoppers, and by harvest time, when I went into that field to combine, there was almost no grasshoppers. They had eaten about 30 feet into the field, down bare, and then they were gone. Meanwhile, across the coulee with the malathion was sprayed, the malathion had dissipated in 10 days or so, and another bunch of grasshoppers were coming in. We didn't have money to have it sprayed again. There was already a poor crop. And at harvest time, there were probably as many grasshoppers in the combine tank as there were kernels of wheat, which wasn't a lot. And after that experience, I went to my dad and I said, Dad, I am done with chemicals. We have done the best we could in 2 years, and we have seen the organic equal or better the chemical system on both those years. I said, I'm going to figure this out. And my dad said, okay. And so I really appreciate that about my dad, that he gave me a chance to really see what we could do. And he was a big support to us. And we continued on. And our farm now became my laboratory. So I got to be a scientist after all. So now my whole farm is my laboratory because we're experimenting every year. Because in those days, this is almost 40 years ago, there wasn't any books about organic. We had a few friends in different states that kind of helped me. But what we saw with our organic system, that from my experiment, I should say, you know, I became a passionate convert overnight, just like that. But what we saw to help me support that, we lowered the cost of our inputs by about 2/3. We increased the value of our crops sold by 50 to sometimes to 100%. We increased the agronomic and economic viability of our farm. We eliminated our operating note in 3 years. That's unheard of in agriculture today, that you don't have to go to the bank and borrow money to buy your seed and your fertilizers and all this stuff at the beginning of each year, and then hope at the end of the year you can pay it off. We eliminate that, and farming became fun. It was really fun. Every year was like a new adventure. It's like a chess game. You know, you have new climate, new weather and everything, new crops to try. Anyway, this is how it works on our farm. We have no irrigation. We're in the short grass prairie of the northern Great Plains. There's no trees. You can remember that first picture. There's no trees on the prairie. There's not enough water for that. We grow one cash crop every 2 years, and normally would follow that by a fallow year. They're saving up water for the cash crop, and that gives us a pretty high probability of success. So, but rotations, for me, in organic, rotations are the key. So we rotate fall, spring seeded, broadleaf, narrowleaf, late season, early season, heavy feeders, light feeders, shallow rooted, deep rooted, in grains and legumes and forbs and oil seeds. So rotations then break up weed, insects, disease cycles. Some crops can control weeds, like alfalfa can really take down Canada thistle for us. Some add nutrients. Here's a buckwheat field that solubilizes phosphorus and brings up phosphate for the next year's crops. So the result is we don't need chemical herbicides or pesticides. So we add no poisons to our land, we have, or our plants, and therefore we have no poisons in our food. And we focus on high nutrition. Rather than the highest yields we can find, we try to get the highest nutrition that we can find. And pay for and enjoy the rewards that way. So it's all about building soil health. Healthy soil comes from, in our case, from legumes that we grow, and then work into the soil about early June for us. One crop is for sale every other year that rotates with one crop for the soil every other year. We do have soil building crops like peas, yellow blossom sweet clover, vetch, sandfoin, alfalfa, and kernza. This is alfalfa we're plowing down here. The result again is no chemical fertilizers are needed. We feed the soil microbes, they feed our plants, the plants feed the microbes, and then it just goes round and round and round. They each feed each other. And the whole thing is an endless cycle. We're mimicking nature. That's what we're trying to do. So this is our 9-year rotation that we're using now. We used to have winter wheat, spring wheat, barley. Those are our main crops. Now we start with winter wheat. That's our biggest producer. Every other year then, about, it's in green, is not for sale, but for soil crops. So then we go to fall seeded peas, green manure. Third year it'd be barley, hulless barley for human consumption. Or we do sometimes lentils or chickpeas, underseeded with yellow blossom sweet clover. The fourth year is the clover year, which can grow over your head. If it grows that high, we disc that down and it leaves a nice mulch, 6 to 8 inches of mulch on the top. We don't have to work that another time for the whole rest of the season. It prevents weeds from growing. It shelters the ground and conserves water. So that's my favorite one, this one. And then we go to Kamut Coruscant spring wheat, which I'll talk to you about here in a second. We follow that with spring seeded peas for green manure. Then we go to high oleic safflower, which we crush for oil. And we supply Montana State University and the University of Montana with all their oil for their kitchens. We bring that used oil back and we clean it, we dewater it, filter it, and we put it in our tractor, so we sell it twice. And when you're a farmer and you can sell your crop twice, this starts to be an economic boom, you see. So it's really a fun thing. So we're trying to make the most of everything that we grow. Then we underseed that with alfalfa, kernza, and sandfoin. Kernza is a perennial wheat. We have a hay cocktail the next year that is really good for controlling tough perennial weeds. And we either hay or graze that. We're just starting with some grazing experiments to put some numbers on how that compares to the hay. In the 9th year of the hay cocktail could be grazed and then worked into the ground. And then we start all over. So that's kind of our rotation that we follow. So after 40 years of research on our farm, I've come up with things that really have fall out to me the important principles of regenerative organic agriculture. The first one is adversity. We mimic nature. You know, you look at nature, anywhere you look in the forest and the creek bottoms and the prairies and the deserts, the ocean, everywhere, it's all about diversity. You don't see any monocrop in nature. There's no spray trucks, there's no fertilizer trucks, nothing. It all works because those plants, animals, microbes, they all take or give something back to the system. And so they're all important and they all help each other keep it going. So the diversity is, we can't do that so much of one year to have all this diversity each year, but we try to do some cocktails, but rotations that mimic the diversity. The second principle is soil health. We create healthy soils using green manure cover crops to nourish and increase the biology of the soil. We minimize soil disturbance by reducing tillage and eliminating poisons altogether. Poisons are chemical disturbance. Oftentimes we don't hear that talked about in that way, but it is. Chemical systems really focus on feeding the plant. Everything is the focus on getting that plant to produce higher and higher yields. That's the only goal you hear about. How much yield do you get? It's like bragging about the biggest fish you got. That's how farmers are taught. Anyway, organic systems focused on feeding the soil. That's a little bit harder to measure, but the results are much more long-lasting and much more important to the health of the soil and to our people, to our country. So that's that story of my conversion. Now let me tell you how I came to connect food and health. This is the story of our Kamut brand ancient wheat. It starts in about 1963. I was a sophomore in high school, went to the county fair, and here was this old guy. He's probably younger than I am now, but he really looked old to me. And he said to me, "Hey, Sonny," he says, "come on over here." He said, "Would you like some of King Tut's wheat?" And he had this old Folgers coffee can full of this giant wheat. And I said, "Oh, sure." And so I went over and he poured this wheat into my hand, and it was about 3 times the size of regular wheat. And the story was that this grain had come out of a tomb in Egypt. There was a fellow from Montana that was in Portugal in the Air Force, went to the bar one night, and a fellow Air Force companion of his had said, "Oh," I said, "I just got back from Egypt, and look what I took out of the tombs," which, you know, that's probably not true, but anyway, that's what he said. "Look what I took out of the tombs in Egypt." And he poured this grain on the counter, and my friends, or my dad, this is my dad's friend was actually, he said, "Wow," he says, "my dad's a wheat farmer in Montana. Do you think that I could send him a few kernels?" And I don't know what the deal was, but he talked him out of 32 kernels, and he sent it home to his dad, and he planted them, and they all grew, which should have been the first clue that it probably hadn't been sitting around for 4,000 years. But anyway, everybody loved the story that came out of King Tut's tomb, and he grew it, and it was a great novelty. It was a very tall wheat. It was a very large wheat. Unfortunately, he couldn't figure out what to do with it. No one seemed to be interested. And then for marketing, it didn't make very good bread. We found out later that it's actually a durum type of wheat, so he should have started with pasta. But anyway, he didn't have any market, and so he ended up passing around to friends and then feeding his extra grain to the pigs. And so that was what was going on in 63. Somebody had grown it and was passing around as a novelty at the fair. I didn't think anything more about it for 14 years. I was in 77, just finishing my degree at Davis. I was wandering down the hall one day to have a break from the lab, found the concession stand, and I bought a bag of corn nuts. And I was just idly reading on the back of the package, walking back to the lab, and it says, corn nuts in those days. It didn't say that today, but in those days it said, corn nuts made with a giant corn. And I thought, oh, wow, I wonder if they'd be interested in a giant wheat. So I called up the corn nuts guys and I said, would you guys be interested in a giant wheat? Oh, yeah, send us some. So I called my dad and said, Dad, see if you can find some of that old King Tut wheat. I said, I've got a live customer here. And in a week or two, he found a pint jar, 2/3 full. He sent me a few tablespoons. And I sent out the corn nuts, and they made their snack out of it. And when I talked to them a few weeks later, they said, wow, this stuff is the best. We'll take 10,000 pounds right now. And I said, well, I don't really have 10,000 pounds yet, but if you'll just give me a year or two, I'll have everything you want. And I called up my dad and said, Dad, plant the whole jar. And so he planted the whole jar in the garden. We hand harvested. We sent it to California in the fall, and they grew it over the winter. So we had 2 crops a year for about 3 years. And meantime, I'd moved back to the farm in Montana, and I called up the corn nuts people. Now we got 50 pounds, you see. That's a lot more than half a pint. And I said, well, we got 50 pounds, and the guy I talked to was gone. No one knew anything about it. No one was interested. They could just cared less. And I thought, oh, man, I missed the boat. And so I put the 50 pounds in the shed, and then another 5 years went by. And then we went with Montana Flour, we call it Montana Wheat and Flour then. We went to our first food show in Anaheim, California, 1986, and my mom and dad were there to help me. We had no idea what we were doing. We built our own booth. We had a flour mill. We were doing stone ground flour. This was built in Austria. I mean, it looks like a piece of furniture. It was beautiful. And in those days, stone ground flour was a big rage. So we were providing that, and we were doing organic. And my dad brought a bottle of this ancient grain with him, and he was showing everybody this grain. And my cousin and I were doing the flour business, and we were showing everybody what our main purpose for being there was. And at the end of 3 days, we had our pockets full of business cards. We were just really excited. And my dad, after talking, 1,000 people went by our booth in 3 days. He had one customer that was interested in one business card. It's actually the same one. He had one possibility, and he was really excited. So we went home and we planted all 50 pounds in a half acre. In 1986, we had one farm, we had one half acre, had 0 products, 0 income. And now, after 30 years went by, we had 250 organic farmers we're working with, 100,000 acres we were contracting with, over 3,500 different products selling throughout the world, mostly in Italy. So if you want to read the whole story of that, chapter 5. So that tells you how we got there. Then here's a little bit of why that happened. I mean, that just didn't pop up from nowhere. My dad gave this friend of ours, Laura Smith, a sample of pasta made with this grain. She could not eat wheat. She was very deathly ill if she ate wheat, and she was had many other problems with food and environmental sensitivities. And I found out that my dad had given her this pasta, and I said, "Dad, what'd you give her that for? You know she can't eat wheat." He said, "Well, he says it's organic, isn't it?" And so now he's more converted than I am, you see. And he just gave it around to whoever he wanted. And she called back the next day, or not, well, a couple of days later, and she says, "What is this stuff?" So she had done some muscle testing that said she used it on foods before she'd eat them, since she thought she could eat it okay. She did eat it. She said, "When I ate this, it made me feel better." I said, "Oh, well, we'll give you some more." And she says, "I have a sister, and she has not only sensitivities to wheat, but many other foods. Do you think we could send her some?" I said, "Sure, we'll send her a whole box." So we sent her a whole box of this pasta. And after she'd eaten it for about 4 or 5 weeks, she called up and she said, "Not only can I eat the pasta, but after I ate it for 4 or 5 weeks, now I'm beginning to be able to eat other things that I couldn't eat before." So it was healing her in some way. And that completely changed my attitude toward what we were doing. It went from a novelty, and a great story about being in a tomb, to like a gift from the Lord. It was something that was actually helping people heal and become better from problems that they had with food. And so I changed my my whole outfit, my outlook of this. And what we found over the years, about 85% of seriously sensitive wheat folks can eat this grain with no trouble at all. So it's not 100%, but it's very high. So then we decided to create a trademark to sell the grain. And Kamut is an Egyptian word for wheat, because we wanted to protect it, because it has a much higher value. This is also, I should tell you, a very low yielding grain. So it wasn't bred for anything, and it has a low yield potential. So we didn't want people to be adding cheap wheat to it and selling it as the ancient wheat. So we had a trademark that we had rules. Now, trademark doesn't mean that we own the grain, as you know how trademarks work. It means that it's a guarantee for your customers. So our guarantee to our customers were that it was always organically grown. It's 100% ancient Khorasan, which is a common name for the wheat. It's high in protein and minerals, and the claims that anyone makes that uses the trademark have to be supported by research. So those are what we started with our claims. And then the Kamut actually is a word from the ancient Egyptian that means wheat in the ancient Egyptian language. Now, they don't call it that because they're speaking Arabic, and they call it Baladi Durum in Egypt. Baladi means native durum. Well, there's actually no such thing as native durum in Egypt, because durum didn't originate there. It originated in Mesopotamia. And but the question was, did it really come out of the tombs? And so I had longed to go to Egypt, and I finally got a chance to go. This is people who wanted to do some experiments with it there. We actually found it growing there. Still was much taller than anything I could grow, and better yields. And I remember the first time I went to the museum, and I asked, where are the displays that came out of the tomb, especially the grain stuff, and they told me, and I went there, and I was so excited. I got to the display, big fancy case, all in glass and everything. I looked over the edge, and there, right before my eyes, was einkorn. And there wasn't any of this stuff. And I thought, oh man, I've been telling this story for almost 10 years now, and I can't verify it. So what do you do? So I was really, depressed. And we were doing some work in Turkey about the same time, where we were doing some experiments there. And first time I went to Turkey, met with my farmer friends, and they said, oh, we know this wheat. We call it camel tooth, because of kind of the way it's shaped. It's kind of hump shaped, big on one end, small on the other. Or we call it the prophet's wheat. I said, oh, that's really interesting. I said, why do you call it the prophet's wheat? I said, does it have something to do with Muhammad? And because, it's pretty Muslim in Turkey. I was all by myself. I didn't want to get on the wrong side of that discussion. And so I, gave them the benefit of the doubt. I said, does it have something to do with Muhammad? They said, oh, no, not that prophet. They said, the one with the boat. I said, the boat? I said, do you mean Noah? Oh, yes. This is the grain Noah brought with him on the ark. I said, wow. That's a lot better story than my old tomb story. And so then I have friends, and we've done a little work in Armenia. It's right next door, next to Mount Arak, east of Turkey, and they've got the same legend. So you know what the good book says, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall all things be established. I said, that's good enough for me. So anyway, you can take whatever legend you like, but that's, it's certainly old. It's an old grain. So then I thought, I really need to know what's going on with this. So we tried to figure out where we could do some research. And I called around in America. I couldn't find in the late 80s, early 90s, I couldn't find anybody that wanted to help me. Everybody, the common idea was that our research, or our wheat in America is bar none the best in the world. There's nothing wrong with our wheat. And one professor told me, he says, if I did the kind of research you're asking me to do, I'd be wasting my time and your money. And I thought, wow, that's not very encouraging. And then we met up with some researchers in Italy, at the University of Bologna and University of Florence, a teaching hospital, a research hospital there. Their attitude was completely different. If you're Italian and you can't eat wheat, well, they didn't, in those days, run down the street looking for wheat-free, gluten-free. They wanted to know what was the matter and how to fix it. And so they were very interested in this question. So we started doing research. Very soon we went from rat studies to human clinical trials studying chronic disease, because in our first study we discovered that the grain was reducing inflammation, and it was actually anti-inflammatory. And so we know that all chronic disease is linked to inflammation, so we started studying irritable bowel syndrome, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome, fibromyalgia, and even we had some RNA studies that we were working on, and they all produced the same results. And this is what we saw: the biggest difference between modern wheat and ancient wheat. So we divided the volunteers into 2 groups. One ate ancient wheat, one ate modern wheat. They didn't know what they were eating. They didn't know anything about what was going on. So it was a blind study, and the professors didn't know which group was having which. It was a double-blind study. And then after 6 weeks, they had a washout period of 6 weeks, and then they crossed over, and each group ate the other diet. So it was kind of had an internal control. So it made it a very strong study scientifically. And this is what we found. The biggest result was the anti-inflammatory properties. For each disease, some of them were a little bit different, the cytokines and whatnot that we were measuring, but generally we saw a 30 to 45% increase in anti-inflammatory properties. We saw antioxidant capacity increase. We saw cholesterol, and particularly for the diabetics, we saw a drop in blood sugar, insulin resistance. In all of our folks, we saw an increase in magnesium, zinc, and calcium levels in the blood, which are all very positive things. And even though the amounts of these varied slightly from person to person, the direction did not. Everybody had the same impulse. They all were improvements. The amount of the improvements was different, but they all were improvements. There wasn't some that had a good result and some a bad result. They were all positive results compared to modern wheat. So that really led me to the conclusion that food can be our medicine, and medicine can be our food, just by what we eat and how it's grown and where it starts. So what's happened to modern wheat? So I'm a wheat farmer. So when people tell me they can't eat wheat, that's kind of a kick in the pants to me. I'm not happy about that. And so, but what happened? Because we're up to 20% of the population now in this country can no longer eat modern wheat without some kind of trouble. And it varies from serious to not so serious, but it's trouble. So what's happened is the goals of industrialization, the industrial food system in America are based on cheap, abundant food. That's the national goal since World War II. And the goal is to raise as much as you can for as cheap as you can. And so what happens, the farmers, they've got more grain. They wanted higher yields, right? That's the whole focus. The wheat was made shorter. It was made disease resistant in some cases. It was really adapted to the chemical fertilizer programs that they were adding more and more to. The millers, well, they wanted part of this. They wanted more yield too. You could get more yield in a flour mill by making the bran harder so it pops off of the endosperm, which is the white flour portion, easier and closer so you don't lose any of the white flour onto the bran. So they got that. The bakers, they wanted more bread for less wheat. And they were able to get that by changing the gluten so that the gluten became like a balloon. It could hold more air. And so imagine a baker, you can sell air for the price of bread. Pretty good deal. And so they were very excited about this. But the trouble is there are lots of unintended consequences that no one imagined would come up. The more complex gluten was harder to digest. Some people had almost impossible time with that. The loss of nutrition plus glyphosate residues found in wheat also caused trouble with people's health. There's a negative effect of fast-rising yeast. You know, the way they make bread now, they put in fast-rising yeast so that it only has time to digest the sugar that's added to the dough. If you compare that to sourdough, that's many hours, sometimes overnight, sometimes even more than a day, that is breaking down complex carbohydrates and the gluten, the protein, that in I think 36 to 40 hours, 90% of the gluten is broken down in fermentation for sourdough. So anyway, that is all a thing of the past, and we have as a result of the sensitivity to wheat. But we don't have it so much with older wheat. So here's the pictures of the different bread, and of course the sizes of the wheat as the breeders accomplish their goals. So, to summarize my lifelong food and farm conversion, I went from using expensive chemicals and poisons to grow high yields, sold at low prices, to regenerative organic agriculture to feed the soil for high quality, high nutrition, less input costs, and better prices. I went from so-called conventional agriculture, which I really think is a chemical experiment of the last 70 years, back to the real conventional agriculture the last 10,000 years, plus a little modern science. I went from growing and selling wheat and barley as commodities to growing and selling a great variety of specialty crops, grains, seeds as food. I went from accepting pills as food, enabling the chronically ill to function. They never heal you, they just allow you to function, to promoting food as medicine to actually heal chronic disease and maintain health and vitality. So, what about the future? What can we do? Well, we need to be doing something. So I decided my role, and Dr. already mentioned this, is the creation of the Quinn Institute. And we did that in the fall of 23. And it's a Regenerative Organic Agriculture Research Education and Outreach and Health Institute, where you've already heard is our focus is healing the earth by growing food as medicine. We focus on plant nutrient-dense seeds in regenerative organic soil, harvesting and peak nutrition, minimizing processing, reducing food waste, building regional food security, and strengthening rural economies. So that's what we're trying to do. This is the region that we service. It's a shortgrass prairie of the northern Great Plains. It's about the size of California, including parts of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. And this is our first annual report. We have 15 research projects, 9 educational outreach projects, 17 public presentations, and I can count this now for my next year report. So that's a lot of fun. And that's available online if anyone wants to check that out. So, in conclusion, we need to change our food system. We need to promote research to help farmers find an off-ramp from the chemical ag merry-go-round that they're on. We need to educate the eaters of America. The fastest growing segment of food in America right now is organic. It's growing twice as fast as any other segment of agriculture. It's now makes up a total of 6.8% of the entire food sold in America is organic. But, of course, we have detractors. And what do they say? They say, our job is to feed the world, and we'll starve if we go organic. Has anyone heard that before? We need to feed the world? Okay, my answer to that is, our job is to help the world to feed itself. Help them, teach them to feed itself, not destroy their agriculture with our imports. In the non-industrial world, conversion organic will increase their yields 2 to 3 times. That's significant. We also hear that there's no future in organic agriculture. I'm sure you've heard that. Our answer to that is it's the only future that really makes sense. And it's possible. If you extrapolate what we're doing now, there's no future for most farmers. Organic is too expensive. Have you heard that? Hear all the time. Our answer, the real cost of cheap food is completely unaffordable. And let me show you how that works. So here's the problem with the high cost of cheap food. Who's really paying? The cheap price we pay at the checkout counter is only the tip of the iceberg of the cost of that cheap food. Here's who's paying the cost. The farmers are paying. Most of them cannot recover the cost of production without government programs and subsidies. And in my neighborhood, 75% of my neighbors are gone. They've gone broke the last 50 years. Our small communities are paying. When the farmers disappeared, we have the decline in Main Street. Our little town of Big Sandy has gone from 1,000 down to 600. Half of Main Street, all 2 blocks of it, is boarded up. The businesses have gone broke. Small processing shops have closed, and the supply lines go longer and longer. You remember how it was here in Columbus, but at Big Sandy during COVID, we didn't have flour on our shelves, and yet we live in wheat country. I mean, that's how convoluted the supply lines are, and how dependent we are on something that's just based on efficiency and reducing costs. But there's a high price of that, and it's very risky if it goes wrong. So the problem, so the Earth is number 3. The Earth is paying a high cost for the pollution it has. We have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico as big as New Jersey. How big does that need to get before we think maybe we're going the wrong direction? We have, in Iowa, most of the wells have water that's undrinkable by the children particularly. We have glyphosate in the rain that falls on our farm. 1/3, we had a big problem with this, and so I started collecting rain samples from every storm and sending them in to Montana State for analysis every year. 1/3 of all the rainstorms falling on my farm has detectable or measurable amounts of glyphosate in it. Because of the tons and tons that's being sprayed, it's polluting groundwater, surface water, soil, and now even the rain. And then the health of our people. Right now, and this came out last week or so, we're up to 76% of our population. That's over 2/3, over 3/4, I mean, is chronically ill. And most of that's due, the CDC says, to poor food. The cost of the food and the cost of health care remains unchanged if you add those two together. They are inseparably linked. We can never talk about the cost of food without talking about the cost of health care. So, we all pay. So we pay more and more taxes, go to pay for Band-Aid fixes for all these above problems. There's no end, no change, no real solution in sight. So, there is a solution, however. I think food grown as medicine by regenerative organic agriculture is a solution. Here's why. For our farmers, it reduces the cost of inputs, increases the value of outputs, and so that increases the profitability of their farms. For our communities, we increase the financial support by a healthy farm economy that surrounds them. We increase jobs at local processing, reduce risk by shortening supply lines. For the earth, we reduce poisons and pollutions, increase carbon and organic matter in the soil. We reduce fuel use to ship goods great distances. For the health of our people, we produce nutrient-dense food with less chemical residues. And so everybody wins. Our farmers win, our communities, our earth, and our people. So, Basic principles for growing food as medicine. Using wheat now as an example, because that's what I know best. Start with good seed. Anytime you start with a farm system, you have to start with the right seed. Avoid GMOs in modern wheat in case of wheat. Plant in living soil, regenerative organic, avoid chemical residues. Harvest at peak nutrition, fully ripe. No premature killing it with glyphosate or picking it green so you can ship it around the world or from country on one end of the country to the other. Minimal processing to preserve or enhance nutrition. You know, in making white flour, we're throwing away 1/3 of the nutrition from wheat. That goes to the pigs. The pigs are eating better than we are. That's what's happening. We don't add health debilitating chemicals like colors and preservatives to our foods. We add natural nutrition like the long fermentation that I talked about. Process as local as possible to promote freshness and shorten food chains, supply chains, and reduce waste. You know, it's 50% of food grown on the whole earth is wasted. Imagine if you could save all that. You could cut your food dollar purchase in half, which means you can afford to pay twice as much for the same amount of money. So with bread, day-old bread's not that bad, especially if you toast it or make bread pudding or do something. We can repurpose leftovers. That's the biggest source of waste in most households. So let's dream a little. How about the future of food and farming? What if we paid farmers by quality rather than just quantity? Pounds of nutrition produced per acre rather than just tons of commodities per acre. What if we label foods for nutrient value, driving market toward good food instead of just cheap food? Wonder if we paid a little more for good food and a lot less for sick care, using food for medicine instead of pills for food. Wonder if we increased food security by eating locally grown, minimally processed food, keeping more money at home instead of enriching giant food companies. Wonder if we paid farmers as pharmacists instead of enriching big pharma. Wonder if we've helped farmers grow their own inputs instead of enriching international oil and chemical companies who extract wealth from rural America. All this can be done with regenerative organic agriculture. So let's work to make the dreams come true, okay? Let's research, let's study, let's teach organic agriculture. Let's promote organic, let's eat nutritious, let's eat local. Let's be wise, be well, be thankful, be kind, and thank you very much for your attention.
All I can say is that this was the best lecture on organic agriculture I ever heard. And you are a very good speaker.
Oh, thank you.
One of the things we were told to translate from Sanskrit to English, if food is correct, medicine is of no need. If food is not correct, medicine is of no use.
Yeah.
And I think today we had best lecture on that subject. Let's give him another hand.
Thank you.
I got two things as a token of thanks for your kindness and generosity to come here. Carbon farming, one of my colleagues wrote that. Is she here? Oh, here she is.
Oh,
Wow.
great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Then
Thank you very much.
the book on with Bobby Stewart, and I did start a series and on drought. This
Drought.
is a very relevant.
We know about
this year.
drought, so.
And
thank you very
then
much.
we thought you might want an Ohio State coffee cup.
Oh yes, that'd be great. That'd be great. Thank you so
That's
much.
another thing we have really. The only other thing I want to say, if we have 1 minute, and the other thing I read was you are a botanist, and there was a botanist. His name was Sir Albert Howard.
Yes.
In 1943, he wrote a book called An Agricultural Testament, and it was a history of organic farming. So I'm going to give you this brochure in case you need to look through it. He is called the father of modern agriculture, organic agriculture. Now, at the same time, also in 1943, Albert Howard was, by the way, head of the agriculture in India.
Yes.
In 1943. So at the same time in 1943, a woman wrote a book, Eve Balfour was her name,
Yes.
And the title of the book was The Living Soil for Organic Farming. So both of those books came out in 1943, and foundation of what you talk today very, very elegantly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's give him another hand.
And anybody gets to Montana, my doors are open for you, so you're welcome to come and see what we're doing.
Shoto is beautiful in Montana.
No, thank you, yeah, wide open spaces. When people say, we're not at the end of the earth, I tell people, but we can see it from our house.